Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome. My name is Katerina Anastasiou, and I'm facilitator for Transform Europe. I'm managing the program's global strategy and migration. Transform Europe is a network of 39 different organizations from 23 countries, active in the field of political education and critical scientific analysis, and is the recognized political foundation of the European Left Party. So today's webinar, we meet and co-host with the Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation, who is also a member organization of Transform. And I will now introduce a little bit what we're going to do today. First of all, methodologically, for those of you that just joined, there is this Q&A box towards the end of the webinar. We're going to open the discussion. So use the Q&A box to write your questions down as the discussion starts. Then there is a chat window where you can communicate to each other, share links, be nice to each other. And we are recording a session, and it will be later on available on the YouTube channels of Transform Europe and I guess the Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation. We meet today on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, and we're here to discuss what is the relevance of the Good Friday Agreement to the left today, what we can learn from the peace process that is still ongoing, and the search, the search for a compromise in very, very tense situations. So without further ado, I would like to warmly welcome Cornelia Hildebrand, the co-president of Transform Europe, and Heinz Birnbaum, now the chair of the Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation Board. And they're going to open up today's discussion. Afterwards, I'm going to be introducing our speakers one by one. Thank you very much. Cornelia, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to hear or to see you. On behalf of Transform Europe, a warm welcome to this webinar on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. Transform Europe, and Katharina was mentioned it, is a political foundation of the European Left Party with 39 member organizations from 23 countries. We are an actor for political education, a left-wing think tank, a network for transnational and international cooperation between parties, movements, trade unions, left-wing activists, and academics. We work on challenges on the European left, on the social ecological transformation, on the fight against the extreme right, on feminism, democracy, and development of the European Union, and the role of the left in all these processes. And of course, we also deal with the global developments and also with the question of war and peace and alternative concept to militarization and war. With our memorandum on the Ukraine war, we discussed different ways of de-escalation and peace, as well as alternative security concepts in our seminars, conferences, and in our future factory. In this context, it's also very important for us to honor the Good Friday Agreement with this webinar and to see what we can learn from this process. Because the Good Friday Agreement was a result of a long and complicated process. I attended in the ceremony honoring of the Good Friday Agreement by the Democratic Party families in the European Parliament, and it was really impressive. It was very impressive to see in which way everyone spoke about the long and complicated process and also of the role of the European Union in this process. It was very impressive for me also to see afterwards in the left group symposium of the Good Friday Agreement. And we spoke with the people they are involved in this process, they were living in this process and with all consequences. And sometimes was it a very fragile peace in this time, in different time. And it is important that the European Union, after the Brexit, with the Windsor Protocol, has looked for a solution under the new condition after the Brexit. The role of the European Union was very important, is very important. And that shows us If the political will is there, the European Union can play a peace policy role. And in this respect, the stability of the Good Friday Agreement is a European issue. It is important to learn from this path for realistic ways for peace and stability in Ireland and also in other countries. A peaceful future for a self-determined Ireland always has a European dimension. And so I wish us a good webinar today. Many thanks.
Thank you, Cornelia. I will pass the word to Heinz, and I have to change it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also on behalf of the Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation, a very warm welcome to all of you. The Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation is a political foundation linked to the party Die Linke in Germany, but we are also active internationally. And I think this webinar is really very important. 25 years ago ended a fierce and bloody conflict in Northern Ireland with the Good Friday Agreement. And now, unfortunately, with the Brexit, there is some uncertainty regarding this agreement. Therefore, I think now it's the right time to talk about this agreement, to assess it, to discuss its importance and the political implications. As Connie said, it's really a very European issue, and I'm looking forward to a very fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Very much, Heinz. So give me a second. Yes, perhaps all speakers can turn on the camera now. Thanks to both of you. So we're going to start now by giving the floor to 4 exquisite speakers. Martina Anderson, former MEP and also the liaison for Sinn Féin for Europe. Professor Colin Harvey, Shane Byers from Trademark, and Heinz Birnbaum. I am going to take the time and introduce each speaker separately, and then each one of them will have 5 to 8 minutes to develop their thoughts. The focus of the first part of discussion would be the Good Friday Agreement, because exactly we're here also to discuss on the occasion of its anniversary. So what is the how is the implementation going? What is the current state of affairs? Do the institutions work? And so on. So without further ado, Martina Anderson, former MP, as I said before, a lifelong Irish Republican. She was a political prisoner for 14 years until her release under the Good Friday Agreement. Since her release from prison, she was elected to the Northern Assembly and became one of the first Sinn Féin to serve on the policing, and was appointed a junior minister to the late Martin McGuinness. Subsequently, she was also an MEP, so a member of the European Parliament, for over 7 years before being taken out of the European Parliament by Brexit. Martina is now Sinn Féin's representative to Europe. Martina, the floor is yours. Thank you very, very much for being here today.
Can I too extend the thanks to you, the organisers, for arranging this event, marking the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, as has been said, a peace accord that brought an end to a terrible conflict in Ireland. You know, a war is a terrible thing, let's not pretend, but the challenge is how to come out of it and how to succeed in conflict resolution. And that is what the Good Friday Agreement showed to the world, almost a template of how to pursue peace. Now, conflicts have only ever been resolved by engaging with your enemies, negotiating a settlement, talking and making space for the other, you know, generosity and all sides moving. So 25 years ago, there was no guarantee of certainty. However, there was clearly the potential to arrive at a peace settlement, and so the Good Friday Agreement was signed, and it was the involvement of the international community, the USA, the EU, Canada, and commitments by the South Africans that helped give the push that was needed to advance peace in Ireland. And the Good Friday Agreement, it gave us power sharing institutions, and it gave us a new beginning to policing. It gave us all Ireland political and economic institutions, and it released political prisoners like myself. And as you said, at the time, I was on my 14th year in prison. But more importantly, for us Irish Republicans, it gave us the right to self-determination. For the first time since partition, Ireland could be reunited peacefully and democratically. Bobby Sands didn't have that opportunity. Patrick Pearse didn't have that opportunity. However, the Democratic Unionist Party opposed the Good Friday Agreement. It actually campaigned and voted against it. And the Good Friday Agreement, it's important to say, it wasn't a Republican document. You know, it wasn't a destination. It wasn't a settlement. It was a journey. And for Republicans and Nationalists, a journey to a new and better united Ireland. And it contained a commitment for human rights, in addition to the European Convention of Human Rights, to be brought forward through a Bill of Rights. The Good Friday Agreement made provisions for a welter of exciting proposals and commitments, you know, through which power could be shared, based primarily on, you know, a reliance on a Charter of Equality and Human Rights. Equality legislation known here as Section 75, which was quite revolutionary 25 years ago, not so much so today. And a Bill of Rights for the North, which would establish parity of esteem. So I say a welter of exciting proposals and commitments. Yes, that's true. And there's no doubt that we are in a better place because of the Good Friday Agreement. That has to be said, and all credit has to go to everybody that was involved in making it happen. Yet 25 years on, commitments are unrealised. 25 years on, we are in a political crisis. And as we sit here today with none of the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement operating. Brexit, I have to talk about Brexit in the context of the Good Friday Agreement, because that has been a disaster for us. The British government did not give a fleeting glance to the damage that Brexit would do to Ireland. Boris Johnson and Liz Truss as British Prime Ministers were reckless and both inflamed tension in the north of Ireland. You know, they weaponized the paranoia of unionist politics, and they did that in order to threaten the EU. Now, be clear, the protocol that some of you might know about that came from the Brexit withdrawal agreement negotiation, that did prevent a harder border in Ireland. The border in Ireland is called partition. You know, we already have a border, but the protocol protected a hardening of that border. It protected the Good Friday Agreement in all of its parts. And it gave the North access to the EU single market, and it also enabled the All-Ireland economy to function. So the protocol did not create a border at the Irish Sea. There has been a border in the Irish Sea for decades. Animals, animal produce, wood, etc. have all been checked at ports that were built in Belfast, in Larne, and in Warrenpoint. They are areas in the north of Ireland decades ago, because the island of Ireland is what is known as an epidemiological unit. Big convoluted word maybe, but you know, checks have always taken place from Britain into the north of Ireland to protect the entire island of Ireland against species and others things coming in here. And what Brexit did was to intensify the checks at the Irish Sea border. Now, the most recent British Prime Minister, because we've had quite a few in recent years, Rishi Sunak, he recently negotiated a compromise with the EU to address some of the points of friction from the trade that the protocol created. And what was known as the Windsor Framework was signed to allow the protocol to operate smoother. I have to say, go back last May, Sinn Féin had a historic election in the north of Ireland when for the first time nationalism topped the poll in this part of partitioned Ireland, and Sinn Féin became the largest party in this part of the island, where we are the largest party in the south of Ireland, and thus returned a First Minister, Michelle O'Neill. However, the DUP resigned its First Minister before that May election, as it could see what way the political wind was blowing. The leader of the DUP is called Jeffrey Donaldson, and he has no intention of returning to Stormont at any time soon. He and the rest of, he's an MP in Westminster, and he, along with the other MPs of his party in Westminster, voted against the Windsor Framework in the House of Commons. Now, only 29 MPs voted against it. An organisation known and closely aligned with unionism, the Orange Order, also rejected the Windsor Framework, and it stated that it doesn't support the DUP returning to Stormont. It has to be said that support for the Windsor Framework has outstripped the opposition by almost 3-1. Most people and most parties want the GFA institutions established, but the DUP does not like the democratic outcome and didn't like it of the last May election. Jeffrey Donaldson, remember, walked away from another political party here known as the UUP, and they were in support of the Good Friday Agreement. Jeffrey Donaldson left them because of the Good Friday Agreement. So perhaps him maintaining the collapse of the Good Friday Agreement institutions on its 25th anniversary is no great surprise, some might say. So today, as we sit here, we've no government, no budget, with a health service on its knees, and the British government is imposing an austerity budget that's going to deepen the cost of living crisis, and that's another topic in itself. And tomorrow, as we head into the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, we're in a deepening political crisis. And when you add, that we have been living in a post-Brexit environment where our rights have been eroded. So people are rightly engaging in a conversation about a better future for this place. I have to draw your attention to esteemed human rights lawyers and jurists from Europe, from the USA, from South Africa. Last week, they published a report, and it was after they came here on a fact-finding mission, and they called the report "The Crisis in the Human Rights Framework of the Good Friday Agreement." So the north of Ireland, we had been insulated from Britain's poor human rights record, and we could all speak a lot about that, but we were insulated when we were in the EU. And that level of protection, however, is now gone because we were dragged out of the EU against the democratic wishes of the people in the north of Ireland who voted to remain in the EU. So more and more people want to see the Irish unity referendum date set even into the future, 5 years, whatever, 4 years, set the date, set the time. And, in the Good Friday Agreement, we won our right to self-determination. So 25 years on, the Irish government should be planning and preparing for Irish reunification. So indeed, that referendum choice, whenever we get it, would be to either reunite Ireland and move back under what Professor Colin Harvey calls under the EU roof, or to stay outside of the EU, to stay linked to a country, Britain, that has stripped away our hard-won human rights, stay linked to a country, Britain, that has removed the Charter of Fundamental Rights from us, stay linked to a country that has told us that it will remove the European Convention of Human Rights, which is the bedrock of the Good Friday Agreement, and stay linked to a country that has shown to the world that it will break international obligations by implementing legislation like, for instance, legacy legislation, and there's other bills that don't comply with international human rights standards. So I will end with this. I'm a Republican, and I certainly want a better future than what is being offered by the British establishment. I want a new, I want a better, I want a progressive, united Ireland, and I especially want that for the next generation to enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martina. Thank you very much. So thank you. We're going to come back in the second round. So thank you again. And we would continue now with Professor Colin Harvey. So Professor Harvey is a professor of human rights and a director of the Human Rights Center in the School of Law at Queen's University in Belfast. He's a fellow of the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice, and an associate fellow of the Institute of Irish Studies. He has served as the head of the law school at Queen's. Before returning to Queen's in 2005, he was professor of constitutional and human rights law at the University of Leeds, has held visiting positions in the University of Michigan, in Fordham University, and London School of Economics and Political Science. He has taught on the George Washington University, the Oxford University Summer School in International Human Rights Law, and on the International Human Rights Program at the University of Oxford. He served 2 terms commissioner. I mean, your bio is amazing. I'm going to read it through. I'm sorry. Fine. Of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, and he's the general editor of the Human Rights Law in Perspective and in different editorial boards. And I leave it there. Calling Professor Harvey, thank you for being here today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Katerina. Very kind invitation, and really delighted to be participating in the seminar this evening. Just by way of context, maybe start by asking ourselves the question, what is the Good Friday Agreement itself? Important to underline that it's both a multi-party political agreement from 10th of April 1998, but it's also a binding international law in the form of the British-Irish Agreement as well. So we're talking about politics and law when we think about the Good Friday Agreement. Also essential to keep in mind that the agreement was endorsed on the island of Ireland in concurrent referendums held on the 22nd of May 1998. So politics, law, and comprehensive democratic endorsement across the island of Ireland. Aspects of the framework have been incorporated into domestic law in both states. I think it's important just to highlight that at the beginning in terms of what the Good Friday Agreement itself is. I just wanted, just following on from what Martina has said, highlight 3 themes by way of introduction and look forward to the conversation. First theme is that we need to recognize how far this society has come. And I know there's a lot, and there'll be discussion over the next few weeks about the progress made, things that haven't been done, the challenges that we're facing now. But in terms of an overall framework, let's be clear, and from my own perspective, if one life has been saved as a result of the Good Friday Agreement, our peace agreement, then it was all worth it. You know, my view is, with many others, that the peace process itself has largely been successful in embedding peace in this society. And despite the challenges that we're facing and the instability that is there, and we do see that peace process does remain secure. I think that's important to say, first of all. Secondly, then, the agreement itself is a complex document, and the framework is complex. It embraces relations and relationships across these islands, north, south, and east as well as relationships within the north, Northern Ireland. But one additional thing needs to be emphasized in the context of our discussion this evening. That's also the fact that, as well as establishing institutions, the agreement promised a better society in relation to rights, equality, and social justice for everyone here. And that promise of a better society remains very much work in progress. There is no Bill of Rights. There's no Charter of Rights. The Human Rights Commission here has been steadily undermined in its work. And developments in relation to equality law reform, for example, haven't been taken forward. Also, I won't need to tell anyone in this audience that the current Westminster government is, how to put this diplomatically, waging a war against human rights in its persistent attacks on human rights and the defenders of human rights as well. We're seeing this across a range of areas, including its proposals on legacy legislation in terms of dealing with the conflict here, in terms of what it's doing in relation to immigration and asylum, and its frankly outrageous plans to repeal and replace the Human Rights Act, really essentially our starting point in terms of the Good Friday Agreement on human rights. So a really deeply concerning assault on the human rights framework of the agreement by the current government in London. The third theme then is perhaps unsurprising. The Good Friday Agreement is not a settlement of the constitutional question because it leaves the constitutional question open-ended. The constitutional future of the North is essentially for the people to decide. The right of self-determination in the agreement rests with the people of the island of Ireland, North and South, in a complicated formula, but which will essentially involve concurrent referendums on the island of Ireland to determine the constitutional future. Post-Brexit, a context where the Northern Ireland was removed from the European Union against the wishes of its people, it's hardly surprising that constitutional options are on the table and being discussed much more intensively. The European Union has made clear, European Council in April 2017, that there is an automatic re-entry option to the EU for the North in the event of the Good Friday Agreement provisions being operationalised and a vote for a new and united Ireland. So while the discussion was advancing anyway, Brexit has very much accelerated that conversation, and it's hardly surprising given what I've said in relation to human rights, equality and social justice, and the outworkings of Brexit and where that may all lead. What's really quite striking about the discussion on the constitutional future is how much of the focus is on sensible and responsible planning and preparing well for possible change. People on this island have seen the absolute shambolic disaster that is unfolding around Brexit, and they don't want a repetition of that. So what's really notable about the conversation and the constitutional conversation in Ireland, North and South, is how much it's being framed by proper planning and preparing, doing the work in advance before these referendums arrive and people are asked the constitutional question. And on that third theme, while I acknowledge that in a divided society, in a post-conflict society, these constitutional questions can be challenging, they're very solidly anchored within the agreement that we're marking and acknowledging and affirming and reaffirming this evening. So in some senses, there's nothing controversial about what we're saying. People have a choice. They'll eventually be asked the constitutional question, and the focus at the moment is preparing well so as people will know what the consequences are. So just to conclude and look forward to questions and discussions and hearing your thoughts and reflections, just three themes really to conclude. One, I think we need to acknowledge the achievements of the peace process. Yes, there is a lot still to be done, but the achievements of the peace process should be acknowledged. Secondly, I think we need to recognize then the work that still needs to be done is outstanding in terms of the implementation of the values, principles and obligations that promise people here a better society in terms of equality, rights and social justice. And thirdly, we need to talk about planning for a different constitutional future. The option of a new and united Ireland within the European Union is held out by the Good Friday Agreement. It's a choice. They can choose to remain in the Union with Britain or join, be part of United Ireland. And on that theme of a better society, just to end by saying that it's absolutely essential that in the discussion about a new and united Ireland, that equality, human rights, social justice, climate justice are also absolutely front and center of that conversation as well. So thank you all very much for listening. It's wonderful to be in a discussion marking the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, and minds are very much focused on the next 25 years and Ireland's future. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. And I would like to welcome our next speaker, Sean Byers from Trademark Trust. Sean works in Trademark was a trade union linked organization that focuses in political education and post-conflict transformation and the new future economy, perhaps with very good ideas that continental Europe should look into as well. Thank you for being here, Sean. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Kat, and thanks to the organisers for the invitation to speak at this event. It's a real privilege to be here. I'm not sure we have any very good ideas that you could take from us, but we'll work on it. I'm not going to repeat what Martina and Colin have just said. I think they've very well captured and articulated the relative successes of the Good Friday Agreement, as well as the opportunities and challenges ahead. What I'm going to focus on is the political economy of peace, which is what our work in Trademark has largely focused on in recent years. And I suppose from a more critical perspective, our argument would be that the very welcome transition from conflict to peace has been accompanied by a shift towards a neoliberal model of economic development. And part of the reason for this is the impact, of course, of regressive economic policies that are implemented from Westminster, which is focused increasingly on growing the financial centre in the City of London at the expense of other regions, the imposition of austerity by successive British governments, and the lack of economic sovereignty here to properly chart our own path. But it's also the case that up until recently, we've had a local political and public policy consensus that the only real economic model available to us is one that's focused on creating the conditions for foreign direct investment and tourism, in the hope that the benefits of this model will trickle down to workers and communities. And this model has involved the provision of subsidies and other incentives to multinationals with no conditions, which has come at the expense of investment in local economies and has largely failed to secure well-paid unionised jobs. The regional body responsible for promoting foreign direct investment is called InvestNI, and I think the other panelists will agree that it's been a total disaster. As has been the case with other Western economies, our once strong manufacturing base has declined. In its place, we've seen the growth of finance, insurance, real estate, sectors that are fundamentally extractive, alongside retail and hospitality, which are, of course, characterized by precarious employment practices and low pay. There's also been a spatial dimension to this, in that policy and investment has been heavily concentrated on transforming Belfast city centre into a consumer, tourist and investment friendly space. And you see that with the emergence of retail outlets, student accommodation, hotels, office space, Belfast's fast becoming a model example of the neoliberal city that we've seen elsewhere. And this focus on Belfast has generated inequalities within Belfast itself, where inner city communities have failed to see the benefits of that model. It's also meant continued underinvestment in border areas, including Martina and the Collins' fine, lovely hometown of Derry, which is home to some of the most disadvantaged communities in Western Europe. So there's regional inequalities that have been built in there as a result of that model. And that's a snapshot of the overarching economic model that's been in place for the past 25 years. It's a model that served to entrench regional, spatial, class inequalities. Insofar as we can talk about an economic peace dividend, research shows, and this is an empirical fact, that the benefits have largely gone to capital in terms of profits, rising asset values, and income from rent. Real wages, meanwhile, have stagnated. There's more than 20% of people in the workforce earn less than the living wage. And it's a real bugbear of ours, that it's a real disappointment from our perspective that 25 years of power sharing have failed to see the introduction of a piece of legislation to strengthen workers' and trade union rights. And so it's a combination of the outworkings of this model with the impact of austerity that has ensured that the persistence of poverty and deprivation in the working class communities most affected by the Troubles, which in turn has fed a range of social problems, including mental health problems, drug abuse, alienation and hopelessness amongst young people, resource competition between communities, and the continued influence of paramilitary organizations in some of those communities, which is another major challenge. So it's really fundamental to the building of a positive and sustainable peace that these socio-economic conditions are transformed. And what I would say to qualify this depressing picture is that there has been growing recognition of the need for a new economic departure. And I know that Sinn Féin have been doing a lot of work on this front in the past number of years, and they've successfully ensured that progressive economic policy has been incorporated into recent political agreements. I know they have plans for a refocusing of economic policy if and when the institutions are established, so that is to be welcomed. And just as there is scope within the existing framework of the Good Friday Agreement for further progress in terms of implementing the commitments that Colin was talking about, there's also scope to use the levers and the resources we do have in Northern Ireland to start building an economy that places ownership, control, wealth into the hands of workers and communities. At the same time, there will always be structural limits to what can be achieved within existing constitutional arrangements, which have an inbuilt democratic deficit. And what I mean by this is that we will remain subject to the whims of a British government that is elected by English voters. We have no say in how the composition of the British government stacks up. And as Martina has said, we're facing into a fresh wave of austerity imposed by the Tories, which is set to make things even more difficult. The offer presented by Keir Starmer's Labour isn't much better, to be honest. And ultimately, to come back to Colin's conclusion, I suppose, is it's this political and constitutional, this democratic straitjacket that will ultimately need to be transcended one way or another. And so I'll leave it there. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
taking the time also, and you will have the next 8 minutes to develop your thoughts on the relevance of the Good Friday Agreement for Europe today. To introduce you also properly, like I should have done before, Heinz is a sociologist and an economist, and since November 2022, the chair of the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung. He has served as the head of the International Commission of the Party Die Linke. He, since December 2019, he served as the president of the European Left Party, action he held in December 2022, and he was previously served also as the secretary of the trade union IG Metall from 1980 to 1996. He has produced scholarly work and has focused on industry and social policy, but most of all, Heinz is the most European of Europeans from the ones that I know. At least thank you very much for taking the time today, and excuse my football.
No problem at all. Thank you very much, Kat, for your really kind introduction. And I will be very brief because I think it was very well explained what the Good Friday Agreement is with the contributions of Martina, Colin, and also Jean. And I think there is no doubt that the agreement, the Good Friday Agreement, had and has still a great political importance, not only for Ireland, but also for Europe. And because it paved the way for a peaceful and social development in Ireland. And I agree very much that it's also a promise for a better society. And therefore we have to talk what kind of policy we need to reach the better society. I agree with Jean that we need a new economic departure because we have to break with a neoliberal model. And I think we can learn a lot of this agreement, especially in the difficult times we are facing. The agreement is an example of how to break the spiral of violence, which we are not facing only in the Ukraine, but also in other parts of the world. It shows that it is possible to negotiate and to achieve success, even in very difficult, in very fierce and very bloody, very terrible conflicts with antagonistic positions. Of course, we all know it was a very long and difficult and also controversial process, but at the end, an agreement was reached that ended the violence and paved the way for future development in the interest of all. The agreement is based on three principles: partnership, equality, and mutual respect. These are principles that are universal and should also be considered on other occasions. Peace will not be achieved by sustained military violence, but only at the negotiation table. This is a lesson we should learn from the Good Friday Agreement. I think it's very, very important to recognize this in the times we are living now. Today, there are uncertainties and risks caused by the Brexit and the fact that very essential elements of the agreement, such as the power sharing, are not respected by the DUP. And therefore, the consequence is that we don't have a government now in the northern part of Ireland. And this is, in my opinion, a very situation, and it's against the democratic wishes of the people. And therefore, we all, as Europeans, we should make every effort that the agreement is fully respected and the new spiral of violence is avoided. This is very important for the European development, for the future of Europe. Ireland, of course, is a very important part of Europe. And what is happening in Ireland has profound implications for Europe. And I think, and therefore I'm really very glad to participate in this webinar. I think we need to raise more awareness of the Good Friday Agreement and its implication, and we should make it a European issue. The Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation and Transform Europe as well are working in this direction. And therefore, I'm really glad to be here and to look forward to the discussion and also for the second part of our webinar. And I think we should talk also about what kind of politics we need to fulfill the content of this agreement. It's a promise, and we have to work in this direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Heinz. Martina, I think this is the perfect pass for you. I suggest we now open the bigger round. What is the next step? How do we get out of here?
Thank you, and I learned as much being here and listening to others as I hope some people got a thing or two out of what I had said as well. And I think that both Professor Colin Harvey and Sean, that they have provided us with that pathway. You know, Professor Colin Harvey outlined how the choice for our constitutional future is clear, but he also emphasized that it's important that we properly plan and prepare for that. And I want to draw attention to a recent research report that Professor Colin Harvey co-authored. He might be too shy to say it, but it's called Making the Case for Irish Unity in the EU. And in the context of what you just said, Heinz, about making the Good Friday Agreement in all of its parts a European issue, I think it is important that that report is circulated to all that's here, and to that work that will inform what Heinz and others are doing. The research outlines why it is important for the EU and why it's in the EU's best interest to take a position on Irish unity. So at the time of the Good Friday Agreement, you know, when you look back 25 years ago, Ireland and Britain were both members of the EU. And EU law, policies and funding touched almost every aspect of life in the North. In fact, there are 151 areas of EU law that engaged with the Stormont Executive and with the Assembly here, part of their competency. So when you ask what comes next, there's two things that are both complementary. Some people try to think of them as separate, but I believe they both can run in parallel. One is, in my opinion, we must take care of people in the here and now, which is in a partitioned Ireland. And that can be done by getting Stormont operating and local ministers in place, especially in the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, to deal with what we're all facing in terms of the cost of living crisis and the economic conditions that Sean outlined and how people are living. And as well as doing that, running parallel with that, we work to fulfill the promises for a better future and engage with the growing constitutional conversation that is taking place, the growing demand for a proper plan and a careful preparation in advance of the Irish Unity referendum, because we don't want the same mess that was created by Brexit. Because the choice, as we said, is a partitioned cold house for human rights. And we've heard lots this evening about what all of that entails, or potentially, and what we will ensure, those of us that are advocating for this, a warm, reunified Ireland, a home where all traditions and none have, you know, international rights guaranteed and protected. You know, there's no ambiguity in law, in policy or practice. The people of Ireland have a guaranteed legal right to determine our own constitutional future. The Good Friday Agreement, as Professor Colin Harvey said, is a legal and a political peace agreement. So when you asked, you know, how do we get out of the situation? we get out of it by planning, by preparing, by engaging, and by giving the confidence to more people to consider and imagine a life outside of what the British establishment is offering us all. And we can get out of the political situation by ensuring that political institutions wider and beyond Ireland understand that they have work to do to fulfill the promise of the Good Friday Agreement based on human rights and society. So just like Ireland and Britain must prepare for constitutional change, picking up on what Heinz has said, you know, European political institutions and civic society organizations, just like Transform Europe and the Rosa-Luxemburg is doing, but others too, have to become involved in the careful planning and preparation, because Irish unity will impact beyond these shores. It will impact on Europe too, and the partition of Ireland is now Europe's problem too. So let's hope that webinars like this expose the importance of, you know, getting a wider political understanding of events in other places as people are emerging from conflict, and then what post-conflict resolution can be like, and how the pace of change can be very slow and how it has to be worked on, and which through solidarity and support we can strategize and strengthen our collective efforts for a just future in peace. And also highlights, I think, that it's not just up to other people to do this, it's up to us all. So, you know, let's hope that this, as we leave this seminar this evening, that maybe all of us have developed a better understanding and not acknowledge that it would be wise and sensible for those of you in continental Europe to understand how the partition of Ireland is not just a problem for those of us who have to live in it, experience it, and want to change it. Because as long as Ireland is partitioned, the fallout of Brexit will forever challenge the EU. So let's plan for an inclusive, peaceful, democratic, progressive process of uniting Ireland so that all of Ireland can once again live under the EU roof. And we all know that roof, as might be called a roof, it's not a ceiling, it's the floor of rights upon which we in the left and others in Europe want to maximise.
Thank you very much, Martina. Perhaps Professor Colling, you can take it from there. I mean, before, when you were naming the 3 points that are essential, no? The acknowledgement of the achievements of the peace process, the visionizing of a better society and creating a better society and planning the constitutional future. I mean, let's say we're having this webinar as part of acknowledging the peace process. I would say it would be, I think, for everyone very interesting if you could project a little bit. What would that mean in 25 years? Where do we have to go? How deep does Brexit influence the prospect of a united Ireland? Is it even possible in the EU? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Katerina. Just really, in many ways, echoing a lot of what's been said. But essentially, if we're having a future-focused discussion about better society, a starting point is to think about non-recurrence, that we build the foundations of a peaceful society on what we essentially know are some of the root causes of conflict in any society. You know, we know that sustainable, stable societies are those that have socioeconomic justice at their core. And I think that's also vital for the discussion about the here and now in the north of Ireland, but also for the future of a reunified Ireland, because sustainable peace now and in the future does depend on those promises around socioeconomic justice being realized. And there are some, you know, Sean, Martina has been highlighting that there are structural issues that are getting in our way about the way in which this island is segregated and divided in the here and now. but it's essential that, you know, one of the things that worries me about where we are now here is that many marginalized and disadvantaged communities throughout the conflict are still the most marginalized and disadvantaged communities in 2023. So there are many people in this society have not experienced transformative change. And I suppose the really, really, really hard question about that, right, which part of the conversation is that about the future, is there are aspects of our institutional structure and architecture that hand essentially, you know, right-wing political parties veto powers over policy formation and development. And I just want to put that out there as a difficult question, right, about our structures and where we want to go in the future. And I suppose a question I have, right, which is a hard question about the future, is that do we want to load those vetoes into the future of the island of Ireland as well? Because they've been a big problem. I have to be totally candid in relation to the North, in relation to this agenda and the blockages that have been perpetually there around achieving some of the things that we're talking about in the here and now. So ultimately for me, ending separation and division, reunified Ireland, is a long-term justice and reconciliation project. In other words, from a progressive perspective as well, we cannot do some of the things that we would like to do in the here and now because of the structural obstacles that are there. So for me, part of the discussion and potential of a reunified Ireland is the potential to transcend and go past some of those structural obstacles. Now, I get the question in the chat about, you know, I don't believe that just getting words on a page of a constitutional document is meaningless unless they actually mean something in reality. So a Bill of Rights, equality protections, you can have the nicest constitution in the world with glowing rhetorical language around rights, and it can be meaningless for people who need those rights to matter most. So we have to look at the structural obstacles to achieving those rights in the real world. So the work of transformation doesn't end when you get a legal text. It's some of those structural impediments. And I think we have to ask ourselves hard questions about where those blockages are in the here and now. But, you know, one thing for me is just, and as a question, if we're thinking about a new and united Ireland, do we want to mainstream some of those obstacles into the structures? That's a debate for another day, right? But there has to be an honest assessment of what is getting in the way of transforming Ireland, north and south, in the here and now. And just to end, you know, my view is if you're serious about preventing recurrence of conflict on the island of Ireland, you need to be serious about socioeconomic transformation and socioeconomic injustice. All the evidence all around the world tells us, you know, what makes for healthy societies, you know, and that needs to be built in to the conversation about a united Ireland. I hope that's helpful.
At least to me, it is indeed. Thank you very much. Everybody, would you like to turn your cameras on so the speaker doesn't feel alone as well? Thanks. Sean, I would then pass the floor to you. I mean, it was also, you know, the political economy of the conflict. What struck me was I hadn't understood the intensity of it, is the confluence of resources between groups that you named before. And I mean, in general, how does the community cope with the situation now, with non-functioning institutions, with Brexit? How do you organize? Is organization the same as before Brexit? Has Brexit had an impact on this? The floor is yours.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that our problems didn't start with Brexit. You know, there are long-run dynamics, including those that have been highlighted by Colin, in terms of the political system we have, that have contributed to the crisis situation that we now find ourselves in. I mean, one of the unfortunate consequences of the political framework we have. I'm not saying I have an alternative apart from unity, but one of the unfortunate consequences of the political system framework we have is that it's an institutionalized dynamic of competition between two competing blocks and ideological perspectives, where, again, for one community tends to be viewed as a loss for another. And this dynamic in particular has given rise to a crippling sense of loss within sections of the unionist community who have tended to perceive change, a necessary change, as the steady erosion of their identity and of Northern Ireland's place within the UK. This sense of loss is most acute within working class unionist communities, which are shaped by their experience of the conflict, as well as the impact of deindustrialization, austerity, educational disadvantage, and so on. And it's in these communities where support for the Good Friday Agreement is most fragile, and where it's hardest to imagine constitutional change. And that's a real challenge for people on the left. It's a challenge for socialists, because the majority support you would like to build would be working class majority support in a socialist Ireland. So that's a huge challenge. All of that has been exacerbated by the lack of leadership from the British government and from unionist political parties. Certainly in the last 15 years, a real sense of defeat and a siege mentality has become the mainstream. And that's represented most clearly by the DUP. And so it's together with the catastrophic miscalculation over Brexit, together with that and the failure to embrace change and to build in a positive, inclusive vision that's led to a crisis of unionism's own making. And that's brought forward a number of tipping points in terms of political demographics, in terms of the composition of electoral support and so on, where political unionism is now in a minority in Belfast City Council. It's a minority in the Assembly. It is a minority in Westminster. And Sinn Féin and Sinn Féin has managed to capitalise on a lot of the anger that is built up over the role of the DUP in society, particularly among people who would be just seeing themselves as moderate nationalist opinion. So that's the sort of the situation we're in. I'm just going to touch on the role of civic society and the trade unions briefly, if you don't mind, because it sort of feeds into what Martina and Colin have been talking about. The trade unions and progressive sections of civic society, including the women's movement, have always provided an outlet for non-sectarian politics, and they campaign strongly for peace. They campaign for some of the protections that Martina and Colin have been talking about. And so there's a sense of ownership of the Good Friday Agreement amongst the trade unions and sections of civic society. There's a tendency, there's an instinct to protect the Good Friday Agreement, and that's all very positive. But sometimes it's led trade unions and civic society organisations to adopt uncritical positions towards the process, to maybe hold back on some of their bolder demands, to hold back on trying to influence the debate, and instead of presenting their own vision, calling for political stability and functioning institutions for its own sake. And this is relevant because if we're looking to the future, there's an onus on trade unions and the progressive sections of civic society to be bolder in their demands, to use different ways and means of influencing the debate, of presenting viable and convincing solutions to the socioeconomic problems we have. Because whilst there's we have no real idea what an all-Ireland, a United Ireland would look like in economic terms. That is still being fleshed out. But much of the Irish unity debate is currently geared towards winning the support of the middle classes and the business class. The socialist case for United Ireland is non-existent. So it's really important that trade unions and the progressive sections of civic society start to influence the debate, start to put their weight behind it, and shape whatever comes next.
Thank you very much, Son. Heinz, this time I will not forget you. Are you here? Heinz?
Yes, no, I had some problems with my connection and therefore I lost you for some minutes, and so I couldn't hear all what you have said. But I would like to come back to the question of self-determination of Ireland, because I think it's linked to the Good Friday Agreement. And very often I'm asked if the reunification of Germany would be an example for that, or a point of reference, and I would say no, because the German reunification was more a takeover and not really a real reunification. And I think we should have a democratic way towards the reunification, and I think the reunification of Ireland will be based on the referendums in the Republic of Ireland and the northern part of Ireland. And I think that's very important. And I think we should, as Europeans, support this objective of reunification of Ireland. I think that should be supported by the European institutions, and in particular by the European Parliament. And I think the left group in the Parliament will play a major role in this process. And Martina was sometimes also guest of the recently guest of the group, the left, and explains the situation of Ireland. I think that's very helpful. But I think it's also another point for me is, as I said it before, the Good Friday Agreement is a promise for a better society, and what is needed for a better society. And I think we need a different policy at European level. And in the last month, in the last time, the European left has improved the relationship with Sinn Féin. I think that's very good, because we as European left support the demands of Sinn Féin concerning the future of Ireland. And we work together for a different European policy, for a more democratic and more social policy. We are facing big challenges: inflation, skyrocketing prices of energy and food. Housing is a very big issue, and we are facing great social inequalities. Then we have the climate crisis, and the pandemic and the war in the Ukraine worsened the situation. In this political, in the political document we adopted at the Congress of the European Left in December in Vienna, we outlined the main elements of a and how to address these challenges we are facing in Europe. And I think it's, as it was already said, it's necessary to abandon the neoliberal austerity policy. We need a comprehensive social ecological transformation oriented on welfare of the peoples, combining social and ecological needs, and so on. We defend democracy, and I think these are the pills for working together. I think that's very important, to have a cooperation between the progressive forces in Europe, And therefore, I think that's also must be the consequence of the Good Friday Agreement and the promise for a better society to improve our cooperation in order to change European policy towards a more democratic, a more ecological, a more peaceful Europe. I think that's our common ground, and therefore we will continue with the cooperation with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heinz. Now I have collected a couple of questions. Some are right in the Q&A box. Some I fished out of the chat. People are shy these days. So I will go ahead and get on with those questions. A question that popped out twice was, what is the relationship of the left in Ireland and Labour in Northern Ireland and Labour in the UK? Is there a relationship there anymore? Does it play a role in the situation? This was asked twice, and I guess this is addressed to you, Martina. I don't know, everybody, of course, can take the floor. Then there was a question asking all of you to explain a little bit what are the most important institutions, spaces where the reconciliation process is happening, like what are the functionalities of this, what's the architecture of this? If you could go a little bit deeper, and I would suggest we take these two questions and then I continue with some more. Martina, would you like to go first?
And I suppose in many respects, I thought, Sean, this would be one that you would like to get your teeth into, because I think that the trade union movements and Labour here engaging with Labour in Britain, it might be how you define Labour. Are you define it in the political context of the Labour Party? And as I think Sean has already intimated, you know, we have a Labour leader who has said, for instance, he would campaign to uphold the union. And so in terms of the offering even that he is providing to the people of Britain, it doesn't seem to be very far removed from the neoliberal model that currently exists. So if we're looking and listening, as I have been to Sean and to Professor Colin Harvey, but particularly picking up on what Sean has said about Labour here and the trade union movement, I would say, and Labour activists and progressive activists, the left in Ireland, I'm a firm believer of participatory democracy, that you don't leave it to those you elect into institutions to make just policy decisions and law. Policy and legislation needs to have the voices of civic society organizations and trade union movements and others sectors that relate to policy development, shaping that policy. And so therefore, what maybe the Labour movement is doing in Britain, and I'm thinking of Jeremy Corbyn and others who are demanding that they have a better society, a better system of governance, a better structures in place than for instance, what the Labour Party is currently putting out there. Sinn Féin, in terms of reconciliation, we would be very much very focused on the fact that, you know, reunification and reconciliation go hand in glove, that you can't have one without the other. We have developed a number of policies in relation to engagement and outreach and respecting differences and understanding each other's differences and realizing that we all have a journey to travel to even understand. We have all hurt each other. I say all in a very sort of collective term, but people have been hurt here, and we've come out of a terrible conflict and people are still suffering. People will take that hurt with them probably to their grave because of what they went through. And there's no monopoly on hurt, and there's no one tradition is more hurt than maybe the other. So we have a lot of work to do to show and demonstrate that in a new Ireland, a united Ireland, that people's place will be respected. But we also have to make sure, and I for one, I don't want to see this part of Ireland plugged into what exists in the south of Ireland. I certainly don't want the same kind of model of reunification that happened in Germany. Although I do believe that there are things happened leading up to that. For instance, Ireland held the presidency of the European Council at the time. And the Chancellor, the German Chancellor, says we will not forget the role that Ireland played in ending the division of Germany. But what happened to East Germany and the kind of model that exists there is certainly not the vision that I would have or Republicans would have for the reunification and the reimagining of an Ireland of equals. And I think for the left, an Ireland of equals in a Europe of equals, that we certainly have much to offer the left because of our experience of conflict, coming out of conflict, post-conflict resolution, reconciliation, all of what we want to do. Reconciliation will not happen without just in a flowery document either, just picking up in the points that Colin had made in relation to having a Bill of Rights. You need political will and you need political parties being able to come together to work towards a better and a progressive society. Unfortunately, the reality is that we have had institutions of government of sharing power sharing, and for some of the parties, they wanted their share of power. They didn't want to share power with the rest of us. So we've had lots of challenges. We all acknowledge we are definitely in a better place. But Sean, you definitely need to be taken forward in Ireland, what you outlined in relation to speaking up, to speaking out, to being loud, to be heard, to be not just acknowledged, but to be involved in shaping the future. There is no point, and I hear it, and rightly so. This peace process does not belong to any political party. It doesn't belong to, and fair play to all that were involved in making it happen. But the peace process and the political processes belong to the people of Ireland. But the people of Ireland, in claiming that ownership, we all collectively then have a responsibility to ensure that we build a better future. And it's not about they need to do something and they need to convince us. Obviously, there are people in positions of influence that can have access to civic society better than others. But I believe the trade union organisation, the women's movement, there are powerful people and organisations here in Ireland. And the one thing conflict, I think, did to us all, it empowered a community of people. I say that within the Nationalist Republican community, to say there's a line that people will not cross anymore, and people will speak out and people will be heard. I don't think that same empowerment from an observational point of view has taken place embedded in the unionist community as much as what I believe it is taking place in our community. So we've lots to do, a lot of work to do. But what Heinz has said, what happens here will impact on Europe. The partition of Ireland, as I say, is now your problem too. And so in a continental Europe, and that's where my role is, engaging outside of the institution of the European Parliament, but to be engaging with parliamentarians in Germany and France and in Portugal and Spain and elsewhere, to get an awareness raised about what is happening here and how this impacts on them and why they should care about it. So I know that dealt with a number of issues in terms of not just labour, reconciliation, but also the power of civic society and participatory democracy. And unless that becomes part of the new Ireland, then there would be a bit of danger of us sliding into something similar of an experience for people in a society that we have now. And I don't think that is what any of us want if we're seriously talking about social economic conditions in a new Ireland that is going to be embrace and respect everybody, and making sure that there is social justice, climate justice, economic justice, and we don't have the kind of discrimination that we have all experienced. And I can tell you, as living in Derry, 25 years into the Good Friday Agreement, as Sean has said and Colin has said, we have places here in this society that are still in the same level of poverty and deprivation than what they were before the conflict, but led to the conflict. And we have a lot of work to do to try to lift the veto off those that are stopping the progressive change taking place.
Thank you, Martina. Sean, would you like to pick on that as well?
Yeah, I'll add very briefly on the Labour question. Unlike in Britain and unlike in other parts of Europe, in Ireland, North and South, we don't have a mass political party that is institutionally linked to the trade union movement, as in a political party that was established and organised according to the principles of the trade union movement. In the North, traditionally the sister party of the British Labour Party would have been the SDLP, which is a constitutional nationalist party. I would have to say that the SDLP has long shed a large component of its social democratic and labour traditions. It's a party that generally speaks for the middle classes and doesn't really have that connection to a working class base anymore. So certainly the SDLP and Corbyn's Labour would have been worlds apart in terms of their general outlook. They may be closer to Starmer's Labour in terms of their ideological orientation and politics. In the South, the traditional party of Labour would have been the Irish Labour Party, which has been effectively wiped out as a result of its decision to enter into a coalition government arrangement with Fine Gael at the height of the austerity period after the financial crash, and to implement vicious austerity on the communities of Ireland. And it's paid the price for that, and I really don't see any way back for the Irish Labour Party. It is very little of a working class base to speak of. In terms of electoral polls, it's in margin of error territory. I think they currently have 6 seats in this Dáil in the South, and a bad election for them could see them wiped out. So the conundrum for the trade union movement, I suppose, is that it doesn't have a political vehicle. Currently, the biggest working class party on the island is Sinn Féin, but it doesn't have an institutional link with the trade union. So that presents a challenge for the trade union movement. How does it go about? We have a potential scenario where Sinn Féin could be leading a government north and south. And how does the Labour movement go about shaping those governments, and by extension shaping the Irish unity debate? And it's important that the trade union movement engages with Sinn Féin, of course, but also holds the party's feet to the fire, holds the party to account and presents its own vision of what a new economic departure, what a new arrangement will look like. So that's the scenario we have at the moment. It's quite a unique one, reflecting our circumstances, but here we have it. That's where we are.
Thank you very much, Sean. Professor Harvey, do you want to intervene also on these 2 questions?
I think that there was a reconciliation point made, and then the left point. Just on the reconciliation issue, it's a good question, in terms of just conceptually what we mean by reconciliation, because it's one of those words people put on the table, and who could possibly be against reconciliation, but it's in terms of clarifying what we actually mean by that term is actually quite important. Like, obviously the agreement itself was intended to be a reconciliation project. And as a reconciliation project, it was never an internal Northern Ireland arrangement. So it's about building relationships across this island and actually across these islands as well, in terms of working the institutional architecture. When that is being consistently impeded, let's be candid at the moment, and the reasons why it's down are well known, that makes that agenda even more problematic and difficult to implement. In practical terms, reconciliation is happening in the real world in civil society, and people are trying to work that. But why essentially, like, let's be clear, that the Democratic Unionist Party didn't support the Good Friday Agreement. They're the largest party within unionism at the moment, and many people feel that part of the current campaign against the protocol is also, in a sense, a campaign against the outworkings of the Good Friday Agreement itself. So, I think we have to be clear about that. But in terms of the new and United Ireland conversation, it's not an either-or debate. That is essentially a reconciliation project as well. It's about facing into, there's a history on this island of avoiding dealing with this. Partition, over 100 years old, has siloed the island. The levels of division and segregation and separation on the island are staggering. They're shocking, really, in terms of how siloed the island has become. So I think that's a project of overcoming that and the structural impediments that it gives rise to. Just an observation about the left, the second point. Two things. One is, it always amazes me about collective movements on the left, how fragmented and fractured they are. I just think that one of the greatest tragedies in the history of progressives on the left is their capacity to fall out with each other, fracture and split into ever diminishing, variations. And I think, to my mind, that happens on the island of Ireland too much as well. That people who should be working together as a collective movement for change, and I can say this as an academic, not involved in any political party, spend half the time falling out with each other and setting up separate parties. And I just think, for a collective movement, that to my mind, that's just ridiculous. But the main point I want to make is this: there's a real danger on the island of Ireland that the left stays out of the constitutional conversation. Now, to the audience tonight, that'll sound remarkable. How could that possibly be the case? But because of the levels of anxiety about entering this discussion, there's a real risk. An urgent problem at the moment is progressives on the island of Ireland, the left, being too nervous to enter this space out of some sort of misguided sort of sense that it's somehow too sensitive or divisive or problematic. That's not such an issue. Well, it's an issue north and south. And I think that's a big mistake, because I can tell you, this conversation is taken off, both privately and publicly on the island of Ireland. The parameters are being set. And if the left, the trade union movement, the labour movement, in its myriad forms on the island of Ireland, stays out of that conversation, it would be a huge historic mistake. So the left in Europe, the left in Ireland, needs to be part of this conversation. And some of the reasons for that, as Sean has said, is that, people who use the language of New Ireland need to be held to account for using that language. When people who are from essentially the conservative tradition of politics on the island of Ireland are using the language of a New Ireland, well, what do they mean by? Do they mean the same thing by new as we mean in this conversation tonight? So, and if the left stay out of that, that would just be an epic and historic debate, however you want to define the left, civic, political, whatever. The left need to be involved in Europe, in Ireland, and globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Harvey. Now I have an attendee, Judith Delheim, actually, who is raising her hand. I think she wants to vocalize her question. I'm going to try to let her microphone work. You can try to speak.
Sorry, this is a misunderstanding. I didn't indicate it.
Yeah. Okay, good. All right. So I'll take it with the next questions. I mean, now, also relevant to what you have been saying for the last round. I'm Greek. The Irish people, both in the north and the south, were most sympathetic people to our struggle during the anti-austerity years. It was actually very moving for us to see. Back then we were debating all together, what is Europe, what is European? All three of you being from Ireland now, except Heinz, mentioned the migration policy change of the UK and the fact that it's not coherent with any understanding of international law and human rights. And you all three, this is a commonality I heard out of the discussion, invoke that as a negative consequence of the situation right now is having to live in a situation where human rights are not there, simply not there, not even interpreted, just outsourced on a floating island out in the ocean. So in this sense, I think the discussion that is taking place here, but in Ireland in general, can be inspiring for the discussion we need to have on what kind of Europe and European Union we want, right? So perhaps we can reflect also a little bit on the role now of the European Union in the reconciliation process. There was also a relevant question to that. Heinz, are you still here?
Yes, I am.
And before
I changed my device.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. Have you been listening in or?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. And now, second question, one of the three actually that has been in the Q&A box, the last one, taking it another level up, the global level. What does it mean, or how do you read the visit of Biden in Belfast and Dublin? And what about President Clinton's visit to the Queen's University? This is a question by Hinrich Kulz, a listener. So Heinz, I give the floor to you on, yeah?
No, I'm referring to the European politics. I think that's very important because the future of Ireland and a possible reunification of Ireland depends very much on the politics we will have at European level. And therefore, I think the European institutions are really very important in this regard. And I think it's the task for the left, because I agree that the left should be involved, as Colin said. I think it's very decisive that the left will make more efforts in this direction. And I think it depends a lot on the way we are making policy. And as I said before, because the Good Friday Agreement is linked to the promise of a better society, I think it's up to the left to come up with concrete proposals and to support that what for example, Sinn Féin is demanding. And therefore we should strengthen our cooperation and to have a political dialogue and I think an exchange of different experiences and go on with that, because until today it's not so much developed, and therefore I think we should cooperate. We should continue with this cooperation concerning European policy, because there's a close relationship between that what is happening in Ireland and what is happening at European level. And I think it's very decisive also the European elections next year and what is going on. And I think it's really very, very important what will be decided at European level.
So thank you, Hans. Would one of you like to take the floor? I mean, there is one more question and it's the last one. I perhaps read it out and then we do the last round before we close. It's also posed into this Q&A box. So I'm reading out loud. Is it true to say that the British government failed to embed into UK law the changes that the GFA conferred on the people of the island of Ireland? I'm thinking of well-publicized struggles of people like Emma de Souza, who had to fight tooth and nail to get her rights as a Northern Ireland-born Irish citizen counted. And this will be the last question. So would one of you volunteer to start the last round?
Okay, I'll get it. I'll start just at the moment. I think I mentioned earlier the report that Professor Colin Harvey co-authored, and Heinz, in relation to Irish reunification, offering us the only realistic pathway to full membership of the EU. I think it would be important to get that report, because Sinn Féin's very clear in our position of critically engaging with the EU. The EU needs to be reformed. The social pillar of the EU needs to strengthen. We had been at a time subject to somewhat criticism from others about we weren't European enough, just because we were pointing out what Europe needed to do to improve. But we've been also very clear that the whole of Ireland needed to be in the EU. You know, with Brexit did, everyone nearly became Euro-critical, because we're pointing to the fact that Europe needed to be reformed. So although the guarantee of automatic return to the EU is it features prominently in many of the discussions, it has been somewhat underexplored, because while Colin referenced 2017, that the European Council has said if the whole of Ireland is reunited, the whole of Ireland will remain under the EU. You know, the British government, given that it has announced its intention to move away from alignment with EU law as fast and as forceful and as many areas as possible, then what we would argue, and we're welcome the fact that what Heinz has said, Rosa-Luxemburg, Transform Europe and others, because rather than being some kind of a detached observer, you know, and that Europe needs to eventually facilitate Irish reunification, because the EU institutions need to, at this moment in time, as the report has said, undergo an assessment of their interest and consider becoming an advocate of Irish reunification. So I think that it is crucially important what Heinz said about the work that is being done. The British government not honouring commitments is not new. So what the British government has done in relation to identifying what we all have here, you can have Britishness, Irishness, or both. In terms of what the British government didn't do in taking forward us being able to be established as here in this part of Ireland as Irish citizens, is very much one of the many areas in the Good Friday Agreement that has remained not fulfilled. Emma de Souza and others have actually challenged that and have done sterling work, but there are still issues in relation to the Good Friday Agreement that have remained unfulfilled, unrealised, and the commitments need to be taken forward. We warned the EU at the time of the Good Friday Agreement. No one knows the British establishment better than us. So with the withdrawal agreement, we warned them not to trust him, because I'm wondering there hasn't been a thesis, and they probably have PhD done on this. The British establishment, in every negotiation that it has had around the world, it signs off on an agreement, it walks out of the room, and as soon as it walks out of the room, it negotiates downwards. So it hasn't got a history of honouring agreements. So the case that has been outlined about what the British government has not done, we don't have a Bill of Rights. There's other aspects of the Good Friday Agreement that have yet to be realised. But given that we are moving forward into a situation, as Colin has said, about the constitutional conversation that is growing, that is happening on the island of Ireland, it is crucially important that the left hear what is happening here, that they move forward with that understanding, and that they also encourage the EU institutions and others to be doing the work that they need to do to help the planning and preparing for constitutional change. Europe stayed out of the referendum, almost in terms of in Britain. And it stood accused of only allowing those in Britain to make the arguments to mainly leave the EU, and the other side of the Conservatives that were arguing to remain. Europe can't stay out of this conversation because it's going to impact on the competencies of EU when Ireland, I believe, will be reunited. So therefore, there's an assessment that needs to be done. There's work that needs to be done with Europe, and we thank Heinz and others for the focus and attention that they are given to this in taking it all forward. But I think, and Sean, we're all being challenged. We all have challenges in the time ahead. And I think that the trade union movement and other organizations as well need to become more focal and not be, no one can afford to be a detached observer making commentary about what others are doing or what they're not doing. We all have to be involved in shaping our future. So an Ireland of equals, of Europe of equals, and we hope at the time of the next European Parliament election that we are back in the European Parliament election with more MEPs than what we currently have at this moment in time. And we hope that that in some way will complement and help shape the way forward for the left, because I think that Sinn Féin brings to the table as honest brokers, and sometimes dealing with some of the comments that Colin has said, when you have difference of opinions and, you know, we're all wanting something better for our society, we're looking for a better Europe, and sometimes the left has become too fragmented and integrated on issues that we needed to be really looking outwards and beyond what was happening around us, as opposed to the tension that can create and end up leading to the fragmentation of the left, as opposed to the cohesion that is necessary for the left to be able to build a Europe of equals.
Thank you, Martin. And Professor Colin? Professor?
No, Colin is fine, please. I've put in the chat the reports actually that Martina was referring to, so hope that's helpful. And there's a link there, which for everyone. Just a few things to conclude. Look, just picking up on the points made, the politics of Brexit Britain and the current Conservative government politics are toxic, offensive, shameful. What they're doing across a range of areas is a fundamental attack on basic values around human rights, equality, and social justice. You know, it is just shameful, both what is being proposed. The vision of hard Brexiteers is just dreadful for any progressive person, for the left, for anybody who believes in social justice, rights, equality, climate justice, but the future of this island, of our planet, some of the values that are being espoused and pushed forward. You know, I'll be very personal and candid. I want absolutely nothing to do with them, you know. So, and I think we need to be clear about that. We're all very, very working hard. Essentially at the moment, we're spending half our lives holding the line to try and hold on to what we have, to try and make the best use of the mechanisms, tools that we have to protect people, to protect the most vulnerable, marginalized, disadvantaged people in this society from an assault on the fundamental values of our peace agreement. And 25 years on, that is hard. That is hard. But people here will keep doing that. Just like the peace agreement, we want the EU to live up to its foundational values. The EU is supposed to believe in all these things too. And when it's not living up to those standards in the way it treats refugees and asylum seekers and migrants, we need to call that out unequivocally. You know, Fortress Europe and all of that, we don't want any part of that either. The EU is supposed to be committed to human rights. Let's see that in action. So, you know, we're talking about an Ireland within the European Union, but we're not uncritical advocates of the EU without question. Critical friends, but trying to say to the European Union, it needs to live up to its own foundational values that are written into the text of its basic documents. And when it isn't doing that, we need to call that out. And I suppose I'll end the question about the Queen's event in a few weeks' time. You've asked about the Queen's event. I'm actually, shockingly enough, invited to that, so I'll be going and speaking about human rights. Let me be clear about this. I'm not interested in going to events that are people standing around slapping each other's backs about what happened 25 years ago. I'm not interested in events that reinforcing complacency in this society. This society and the most marginalized and vulnerable people in this society are in a bad space. And those promises need to mean something. So if I go to any of these events, I'll be doing exactly what I've said tonight in this broadcast. I'll be asking, where are those promises? Why haven't they been kept? And when people talk about transformational change, whether it's the here and now in the North, Northern Ireland today, in relation to the Good Friday Agreement, or it's in a new and united Ireland in the future, I'm involved in these conversations because I want transformative change to be meaningful. I don't want, and I'm not interested in the rhetoric of it. It needs to make a difference to people's lives. So I'll be saying that. I doubt I'll meet Bill Clinton or Hillary Clinton, but if I do, that's what I'll be saying as well. You know, these promises need to be meaningful for people here, across these islands, in Europe, and globally as well. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate.
Thank you very much, Professor Harvey. Thank you very much. Sean, would you take the floor? And then Heinz, you can prepare for your last thoughts.
Yeah, I suppose it's just building on what has been said. I have to confess that, and this isn't going to win me many fans, I was sympathetic to left-wing exit arguments in Britain, although I understood the ramifications of Brexit in terms of how it would work out in Ireland. Unfortunately, we ended up with a Tory Brexit due to political developments. I suppose I recognise that, you know, it was EU membership that led to a softening of, or one of the factors that led to the softening of the border in Ireland. And I also recognise that guaranteed EU membership provides probably the fastest route to Irish unity, and that's a pragmatic question that has to be considered. You know, it's a key attraction for maybe those who are agnostic on the constitutional question or who have shifted in light of Brexit, that guaranteed membership of the EU. So I recognise that support for the EU in Ireland is like overwhelming. 90% approval of EU membership in Ireland. So I understand those realities, I suppose, but that has to be informed by a critical debate and honesty, I suppose, about what the European Union represents in its current format and its overall trajectory. The constitutionalization of neoliberal economics within the treaties, which cannot be changed unless every member state votes to do so. The increasing militarization of the European Union, the prospect of a European army, which is where PESCO is headed. It's not something none of us want to see. Fortress Europe, as Colin has mentioned, with absolute abominable treatment of migrants in the Mediterranean, and the European Union's absurd fiscal rules, which represent a structural obstacle. We've talked about structural obstacles. Represents a structural obstacle to transformative public investment in a united Ireland. So I recognise and understand that Irish unity is likely to be built on EU membership, but it has to be informed by a critical debate, a conversation about this, and a conversation about the realistic prospects of reforming the European Union in the direction that we would like to see it reformed. And I suppose, just to finish, that's why events like this are important. That's why the connections between the European left are important to thrash some of these issues out, discuss tactics and strategy, areas of cooperation, and so on. So I'm just very thankful for the invitation to speak here, and I hope I haven't lost too many friends in the process.
I don't know how many you lost, but I can tell you made some. So Heinz, the floor is yours.
No, I think it's very important, the relationship between that's what's going on in Ireland and in Europe. And I think the question of the European Union and the development of the European Union is crucial for that. And therefore, the European left wants to have really a radical change of European policy. I think that what Sean was saying is very, very important, because the European Union is based on treaties which are treaties for a more neoliberal policy, and therefore we have to change it. And I think we have to change also the economic policy at European level, and therefore we should cooperate and to work together for another policy, because I think that's very, very important. And Colin said also the EU is crucial, but we don't have an uncritical position concerning the EU. I think that's the right position, to be more critical with that what is going on at European level. But there is no doubt that it's the Irish question is also a European issue. And therefore, I think that's our starting point, and that's the basis for our cooperation. But it's quite clear that we have to change it, because we are facing big challenges, and it's not possible. And the current policy of the Commission and so on doesn't correspond to the needs, and we have, and doesn't correspond to the challenges we are facing, and therefore we need a change of politics. And let me say, we should also involve the trade unions in this discussion. The European left recently improved the relationship with the European trade unions, and we should continue with that. And so I would like, at the end, thank you all for your very interesting contributions. And I think we should continue with our political dialogue in order to fulfill the promise of the Good Friday Agreement.
Thank you very much, Heinz. Wonderful closing words. Thank you, everyone, for staying with us for 2 hours. I'm happy to close the webinar today, and I'm looking forward to the next one, because as I understand it, all eyes are on Ireland and Northern Ireland now. Thank you very much. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye. Many thanks. We will continue.